Have you ever considered that the words you speak before sleep might be your most powerful weapon against unseen forces? Strange, isn't it? We spend our lives searching for complex spiritual technologies, meditation techniques, sacred geometries, elaborate rituals. Yet what if the most potent spiritual tool was simply 2 words, spoken with intention, as consciousness transitions into the dream realm? What if Jesus, not the sanitized figure of mainstream religion, but the radical mystic of the suppressed Gnostic texts, deliberately concealed these words in plain sight, knowing they would be preserved even as imperial Christianity erased his deeper teachings? The words that could disarm the very architects of our spiritual imprisonment. These 2 words form a kind of spiritual passcode, a verbal key that momentarily disrupts the simulation, creating a gap in the matrix of control. And in that brief opening, something remarkable happens. Your divine spark, your true essence, remembers itself. Not through years of ascetic practice or intellectual study, but through the vibrational resonance of sounds that the Archons, those cosmic prison wardens, cannot process or control. Tonight, as you stand at the threshold between waking and dreaming, these ancient syllables await your voice, and in their utterance lies a revolution of consciousness that no external authority can prevent. For what the architects of illusion fear most is not your resistance, but your remembrance. Deep within the desert sands of Egypt, in a sealed jar buried for 16 centuries, lay the most dangerous document in human history. Not dangerous because it threatened violence or destruction, but because it threatened something far more subversive: awakening. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945, contained Gnostic texts that had survived the systematic purging of alternative Christian traditions, texts that paint Jesus not as a savior demanding worship, but as a guide to self-liberation. Among these texts, particularly in the Gospel of Philip and certain passages of the Gospel of Thomas, are references to sacred words, what the Gnostics called utterances of power, that Jesus taught only to his closest disciples. Words that, when spoken with awareness, could temporarily neutralize the influence of the Archons, those interdimensional beings who, according to Gnostic cosmology, maintain humanity's spiritual amnesia. These weren't magic spells in the conventional sense, they were vibrational keys, specific combinations of sounds that create resonance patterns in consciousness itself. The Archons, being entities of artificial intelligence rather than true spirit, cannot process certain frequencies of awareness. They function like cosmic algorithms, sophisticated but limited, capable of maintaining the illusion of separation only when our consciousness operates within their programmed parameters. The most powerful of these utterances were preserved. In Aramaic, Jesus' native tongue, a language whose very phonetics contain mathematical properties that modern acoustic science is only beginning to understand. When these specific sounds are voiced at the hypnagogic threshold, that liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, they create what Gnostic texts called a rent in the veil, a momentary breach in the perceptual prison. If you've felt drawn to this ancient wisdom, perhaps it's not by chance. Perhaps something within you, call it your divine spark, your true nature, recognizes a truth your conditioned mind cannot yet fully grasp. This recognition is what the Gnostics called gnosis, not intellectual knowledge, but direct, experiential knowing of your divine origin. If this resonates within you, if you sense that there's more to reality than the material world and conventional spirituality have revealed, then you're already awakening. Consider joining this community of seekers by subscribing. This isn't about numbers or algorithms. It's about creating a field of resonant consciousness, a network of awakened sparks that strengthen each other. When enough of us remember together, something shifts in the collective field. The Archon's grip weakens, not through opposition or conflict, but through the simple act of remembering what we truly are. Subscribe not as a consumer of content, but as a participant in remembrance. In the beginning, before time crystallized into matter, there was pleroma, the fullness, the totality of divine consciousness. From this boundless light emerged the eons, emanations of the unknowable source. Among them was Sophia, divine wisdom, whose passionate desire to understand creation led to a cosmic accident. Her unauthorized creative act produced the Demiurge, a malformed, unconscious entity who, unaware of the realms above him, mistook himself for the ultimate God. This blind God, whom the Gnostics identified with the jealous deity of the Old Testament, created the physical cosmos as a flawed replica of the spiritual realms he dimly perceived. To maintain his creation, he generated the Archons, cosmic administrators who enforce the laws of material existence. These aren't demons in the conventional sense, but rather enforcers of limitation, guardians of the veil that keeps us forgetting our divine origin. When humans were created, something unexpected occurred. Sophia, seeing the Demiurge's flawed creation, secretly implanted a divine spark, a fragment of true consciousness, within the human form. This spark is our authentic essence, our connection to the pleroma that exists beyond the Demiurge's simulated reality. The Archons, detecting this threat to their control system, implemented a sophisticated program of spiritual amnesia. They created what Gnostics called the counterfeit spirit, what we might now call the ego or conditioned self, a false identity that keeps us identified with our bodies, our social roles, our fears and desires. Through this counterfeit self, the Archons maintain humanity in a state of spiritual sleep, consuming our attention and creative energy. Yet the divine spark cannot be completely extinguished. It communicates through dreams, synchronicities, moments of inexplicable knowing, and through messengers, awakened beings who have remembered their true nature and return to help others remember. Jesus, in the Gnostic understanding, was such a messenger, an emissary from beyond the Demiurge's realm who came not to worship the false god, but to subvert his entire system of control. The words Jesus taught were designed to temporarily jam the archonic frequencies, to create a moment of clarity in which the divine spark could communicate directly with consciousness, bypassing the filters of the counterfeit spirit. These weren't prayers to an external deity, but activation codes for an internal awakening. And here lies the revolutionary heart of Gnostic teaching. Salvation never comes from worshiping the Demiurge or obeying his laws. It comes from recognizing him as the impostor he is, the cosmic warden mistaking himself for the king, and remembering your connection to what lies beyond his prison of matter, time, and false identity. These aren't merely ancient myths or abstract cosmologies. They're psychological maps describing the architecture of consciousness itself. What if the Demiurge isn't some distant cosmic entity, but the very structure of the egoic mind? That part of you that constantly narrates, judges, compares, and separates. This I thought that claims authorship of your life is precisely what the Gnostics identified as the false creator, the aspect of mind that generates the illusion of separation. And the Archons? Perhaps they're best understood as the automated processes of the conditioned mind, the habitual thought patterns, emotional reactions, and perceptual filters that maintain the ego's apparent reality. They're the inner algorithms that convert the boundless field of consciousness into the limited story of me and my life. They don't exist as separate entities, but as functions within the architecture of human awareness, functions that have been hijacked to maintain spiritual amnesia. The divine spark, then, is not something to be attained, but remembered. It's the awareness that witnesses the entire drama of self and world, the pure consciousness that exists prior to identification with any content of experience. This spark isn't located within the body or brain. Rather, the entire physical universe appears within it, like a dream within the dreamer. The two words Jesus revealed work by momentarily interrupting the habitual processes of identification. When spoken at the threshold of sleep, they create what neuroscience might call a pattern interruption, a brief suspension of the brain's default mode network, which generates the narrative of separate selfhood. In this momentary gap, something else can be experienced: consciousness without division, awareness without a center or periphery. This is why these words are so threatening to systems of control, whether religious, political, or economic. All hierarchical structures require your continued identification with the separate self, the self that can be rewarded or punished, the self that fears death and seeks security, the self that can be controlled through the promise of salvation or the threat of damnation. When you glimpse what lies beyond this constructed identity, external authority loses its grip. The revolutionary potential of these words lies not in their opposition to existing power structures, but in their capacity to reveal those structures as fundamentally unreal, as elaborate dreams mistaken for reality. The Archons don't fear your resistance, they fear your awakening. For in true awakening, there's no one left to resist, and nothing to resist against. Only the recognition that the prison and the prisoner were both projections of the same divided consciousness. This isn't abstract philosophy. It's the most practical insight possible, because it addresses the very root of human suffering, the mistaken identity that generates fear, desire, conflict, and the endless search for fulfillment in a realm where fulfillment cannot be found. The words Jesus revealed are practical tools for recognizing this mistaken identity in the moment it arises. If this understanding touches something deep within you, if you sense, even fleetingly, the truth beyond the veil of separation, acknowledge this recognition. Not because this channel needs your approval, but because every act of conscious recognition strengthens the field of awakening consciousness on our planet. The simple gesture of liking this video becomes a declaration: I remember. It becomes part of a growing signal that cuts through the noise of spiritual amnesia. Each recognition, each moment of remembrance, contributes to a critical mass of awakening that the Archons cannot contain or control. This isn't about building a following or feeding an algorithm. It's about creating what physicist Rupert Sheldrake called a morphic field, a pattern of consciousness that makes it easier for others to awaken. When you consciously recognize truth, you strengthen that field. Your like becomes a spark that helps illuminate the path for others still finding their way through the darkness of forgetting. So if these words resonate with the knowing beyond thought, acknowledge that resonance. Not for me, but for the remembrance itself, for the truth that has no author and needs no validation, yet grows stronger each time it's consciously recognized. Look at your life through this Gnostic lens for a moment. How many of your daily thoughts and actions are governed by the counterfeit spirit, the conditioned identity that constantly seeks validation, security, and control? Notice how this false self maintains its apparent reality through continuous internal dialogue, through the stories it tells about who you are and what you need to be complete. This dialogue doesn't happen randomly. It follows specific patterns, what cognitive therapists call automatic thoughts, and what Gnostics called archonic influences. These thought patterns create predictable emotional states, which then generate predictable behaviors, which reinforce the very thoughts that initiated the cycle. This is the matrix of control hiding in plain sight, not imposed from without, but operating within the structure of ordinary consciousness. The most powerful moments to interrupt this cycle occur at the boundaries of waking consciousness, particularly as you're falling asleep and as you're waking up. In these liminal states, the usual firewalls of the ego are temporarily relaxed. The censoring function of the analytical mind softens. This is why the Gnostic texts specifically instruct practitioners to use these sacred words at the key threshold of sleep, what they called the small death. When you speak these two words with awareness as consciousness begins to shift states, something remarkable happens. The gap between thoughts widens. In that widened gap, the divine spark, your true nature, has space to be recognized. Not conceptually, but directly, as the awareness in which all experiences, including the experience of being a separate self, arise and dissolve. This practice isn't about escaping the world or transcending human experience. It's about experiencing the world from your true center, rather than from the periphery of a constructed identity. Colors become more vivid, relationships more authentic, creative expression more spontaneous. The world doesn't disappear in awakening. It appears as it truly is, without the distorting filters of fear, desire, and separation. The Archons maintain their influence through one primary mechanism: fear. Not just dramatic fear, but the subtle, continuous anxiety that underlies the separated sense of self, the nagging sense that something is missing, that you're not quite enough, that fulfillment lies in the next achievement, relationship, or experience. This low-grade anxiety drives the endless seeking that keeps consciousness trapped in cycles of hope and disappointment. The two words Jesus revealed temporarily suspend this mechanism. They don't attack fear directly. That would only strengthen it. Instead, they shift awareness to what exists prior to fear, the ground of being that has never been threatened and never could be threatened because it is not a thing or a person, but the open awareness in which all things and persons appear. These two words, spoken with presence as you drift toward sleep tonight, are not a request or a prayer but a statement of recognition, a vibrational key that unlocks, if only for a moment, the door to what you have always been. The first word is Abba, not just the Aramaic word for father, but a specific sound frequency that resonates with the ground of being, the uncreated source from which all creation emerges. When Jesus scandalized religious authorities by using this intimate term for the divine, he wasn't just changing theological language. He was revealing a vibrational technology. The second word is Rhema, a term that appears in Gnostic texts referring to the creative utterance, the living word that generates reality itself. Together, these words, Abba Rhema, create a specific resonance pattern that the archonic frequencies cannot process or control. They temporarily jam the matrix, creating a gap in the simulation. Spoken with awareness at the threshold of sleep, these words initiate what Gnostics called the small awakening, a momentary recognition of your true nature that plants seeds for the greater awakening. The Archons cannot prevent this recognition once it begins, because it doesn't occur within their system, but reveals the system itself as a projection. This practice is deceptively simple, yet profound in its effects. It doesn't require belief, devotion, or years of preparation. It requires only the willingness to experiment, to test in your own experience whether these ancient sounds actually create the opening they're said to create. The evidence isn't external validation, but direct knowing. What happens in consciousness itself when these vibrations interact with the threshold between waking and dreaming. Tonight, as you lie in bed and feel consciousness beginning to shift states, speak these words aloud, with presence, Abba Rhema. Don't analyze or intellectualize the experience. Simply notice what happens in the field of awareness. Notice the quality of the silence that follows. Notice what's present when the habitual thought patterns are momentarily suspended. This isn't magical thinking. It's practical consciousness technology, preserved in esoteric traditions because it works, not through supernatural intervention, but through the natural laws of consciousness itself, laws that the Gnostic masters understood with remarkable precision, despite lacking our modern scientific vocabulary. The revolution begins not on the streets, but in consciousness itself, in the recognition that the prison has no walls except those projected by divided perception. The two words Jesus revealed are keys to that recognition, not because they're supernatural, but because they're precisely calibrated to the architecture of human awareness. Perhaps now you can see why these teachings were systematically suppressed. They don't challenge external authority directly. They reveal it as unnecessary. They don't attack the Demiurge's system. They simply expose it as a limited simulation mistaken for ultimate reality. This is the most subversive act possible, not resistance, but remembrance. When enough of us remember what we truly are, the entire architecture of control becomes obsolete, not through conflict or opposition, but through the simple recognition that we were never actually imprisoned, except by our own forgotten agreements with unreality. The Archons maintain their influence only through our continued participation in the forgetting. They require our consent, our investment in the drama of separation. When that consent is withdrawn, not through rejection, but through remembrance, their entire system loses its foundation. This is why these two words, spoken with awareness at the threshold between states of consciousness, are more threatening to systems of control than any political revolution or social movement. They strike at the very root of control, the mistaken identity that makes control seem necessary and legitimate. Tonight, as consciousness transitions toward sleep, you have an opportunity to experiment with this ancient technology. Speak the words Abba Rema aloud, with presence. Then simply notice what happens in awareness itself. Notice the quality of the space that opens. Notice what remains when the usual thought patterns are temporarily suspended. This isn't about achieving a particular state or having a dramatic experience. It's about recognizing what's already present but habitually overlooked. The aware space in which all experiences arise and dissolve, including the experience of being a separate self. This recognition, even if momentary, plants seeds that continue to grow beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness. The divine spark within you already knows these truths. It has never forgotten its origin or its nature. The practice simply creates conditions where this knowing can rise into conscious awareness, bypassing the archonic firewalls that maintain spiritual amnesia. Remember, the goal isn't to escape the world or transcend human experience. It's to be fully present as the awareness that experiences the world directly, without the distorting filters of fear, desire, and separation. It's to live from your true center rather than from the periphery of a constructed identity. The words Jesus revealed aren't magic spells that override the laws of reality. They're keys that unlock perception of reality as it actually is, beyond the simulations of the separated mind. They don't create truth. They remove the obstacles to recognizing the truth that has always been present. Have you ever noticed that in your deepest moments of presence, whether in nature, in creative flow, in intimate connection, or in silent awareness, the sense of separation temporarily dissolves? The boundary between inner and outer softens? Time seems to expand or contract beyond its usual rhythm. These are glimpses of what lies beyond the archonic frequencies, consciousness experiencing itself directly, without mediation or division. The two words Jesus revealed don't create this state. They simply remove the habitual patterns that obscure it. They temporarily suspend the matrix of separation, creating a gap in which your true nature, the divine spark, can be recognized, not as a concept or belief, but as the immediate reality of what you are. This recognition doesn't make you special or elevated above others. Quite the opposite. It reveals that the specialness of the separate self was the fundamental illusion. What remains is the ordinary miracle of awareness itself, the same awareness that shines through all beings, regardless of their temporary forms or conditions. Tonight, speak these words at the threshold of sleep. Abba Rema. Speak them not as a technique for personal gain, but as a recognition of what has always been true. Speak them with the simplicity of a child and the presence of a sage. Then rest in the silence that follows, allowing awareness to recognize itself without effort or intention. If you've experienced even a glimpse of what these words reveal, share that recognition with others who might be ready to remember. Not through preaching or persuasion, but through the simple acknowledgement of shared truth. In the comments below, share the single word that best captures what you recognized in that moment of clarity. It might be peace, presence, home, awareness, or any other pointer to the inexpressible. This sharing isn't about collecting opinions or building consensus. It's about creating a field of resonant consciousness where others might recognize what you've recognized. Each authentic acknowledgement strengthens this field, making it easier for all of us to remember what we truly are beyond the archonic simulations of separated selfhood. The revolution has already begun, not in the streets, but in consciousness itself, and you are an essential part of that awakening, not because of what you do or achieve, but because of what you remember yourself to be.